The most important thing that people say after having a hand reader, they say, I feel I've been given permission to be myself. I have been seen like no one's ever seen me before. I feel understood. I feel like you know what it's like to be me, and that's okay.
Are you curious about discovering ways of making your life better? Then welcome to my podcast. I'm Bob Nickman, and this is The Exploding Human. Listen in while I talk with all kinds of people in the fields of personal growth, health and healing, alternative therapies, psychology, spirituality, environment, and the future. I'm looking for those answers that make life better for everyone. You'll meet cutting-edge practitioners, doctors, artists, filmmakers, business people, and those who have overcome challenges. The brave, the curious, anyone who is out there helping us humans to explore, expand, and explode. Hey, welcome to The Exploding Human. My name is Bob Nickman. My guest today is Christopher Jones, who's one of the leading figures in modern hand reading. And we're going to be talking about what we can learn about ourselves from hand reading, from the size of the hand to the length of the fingers, to the nails, to the fingerprints, and how Christopher blends his skills in hand reading with sociology, psychology, and esoteric Buddhist principles. It's a fascinating talk. It's something I knew absolutely nothing about. We even talk a little bit about Jimi Hendrix, who had these extremely long fingers and interesting hands, and his fingerprint patterns, particularly on the left-handed index finger. He was a left-handed guitar player, and how that unique pattern was an indication of his incredible creativity. Of course, we're going to be getting into Christopher's new book, The Palmistry of Fingerprints. So let's jump in. This is Christopher Jones. You're in New Zealand, I'm in Los Angeles, and we're going to be talking about hand reading.
Thank you for having me on your show, Bob. It's a pleasure to be here. There's nothing I like better than talking about hand reading.
Yeah.
I've been doing it for 40 years, so I've got a few things to say about it. So lovely to meet you. Let's make it happen.
My first question is, it's not really even a question. It's, can you explain, because we talked a little bit about this before we started recording. There's palmistry, there's hand reading, and then there's the other word, what was it?
Chirology.
Chirology. Okay. So they're all kind of the same thing, but what is it? What are we going to be talking about? When I always think it's like you're going to look at my palm and look at the lines and possibly the fingerprints and be able to tell things about what. This is so foreign to me. I've never done this.
Oh, yeah, well, that's a really good question to start with. Thank you, Bob. I think the word hand reading is probably the best word to use. It's an all-encompassing term. It's quite neutral. The traditional name for the study of the hand or the palm is palmistry. That's an old English word that kind of dates when we think about the 14th century and really describes a kind of book that contains knowledge about hand reading. In those days, they called it chiromancy, actually. That was the proper term for the study of the hand prior to the 17th century. And you're right that the primary emphasis within that particular approach to the hand was the study of the lines of the hand. And most people think, when they think about hand readers, they think of gypsies and they think of the palmist at the pier who's going to read their hand and tell their fortune. And they always think that they're going to talk about the lifeline and the headline and the heartline. And that's the kind of common image that people have of hand readers. But that's actually kind of really rather limited in terms of its scope, because hand reading actually is literally the study of everything from the wrists down. So we don't just look at the lines of the hand. Probably more importantly, we study the morphogamy of the hand, so like the shape and the structure of the hand, the condition of the thumb, the length of the fingers, whether the fingers are bent or straight, the nails. I mean, there's a huge body of literature on the clinical and diagnostic medical significance of the nails. And then, of course, as you mentioned, also there's the fingerprint patterns. And it's probably the fingerprints that are the most distinctive part of the study of hand reading. Chirognomy, the study of the shape of the hand, was developed really mainly in the 19th century, but it's not until the 20th century that you have fingerprints coming on board, because what most people don't realize is that fingerprints weren't used by the police before 1901. The first police force in the world to use fingerprints for identification purposes in criminal cases was the British police force based out of Scotland Yard in London, and they adopted the system in 1901. The Argentinians were pretty quick on it as well. There's a guy called Juan Fusatic in Argentina. But the guy who classified fingerprints was Francis Galton, and he first classified the fingerprints in 1892. So it's only about 130 years that the knowledge of fingerprints has been around, has been available for people to use. And that really, I think, marks the sort of dividing line between modern hand reading, which we like to call chirology, which means literally the study of the hand. Chir is Greek for hand, and palmistry, which is kind of goes before about 1900. So there are a lot of very famous Victorian palmists. There was a guy called Cairo, based in London, who was connected with high society, and he knew the Prime Minister Gladstone, and he knew famous actors. He read the hands of Mark Twain and Oscar Wilde and Sarah Bernhardt, and he knew all these people, and became very famous. And he later became a Hollywood scriptwriter in the 1930s. And there was a guy in New York called William Benham, who was much more serious about his hand reading, and he had an institute in New York where he gave vocational guidance based upon the shape and the form of the hand. And there was another guy called the Comte de Saint-Germain, which was a rather pretentious title for a guy who ran a society in Chicago around that time as well. So there was all these people were quite well known, but what they all have in common is that their approach to looking at hands was really looking at the lines of the hand. And none of them talks about the fingerprint patterns at all. So that's really the dividing point, I think, and that's the beginning point of my book, The Palmistry of Fingerprints, is to say modern hand reading really starts by looking at the fingerprint patterns, and we can learn a lot from the empirical researches of Galton and the subsequent anthropologists and medical scientists into the significance of fingerprint patterns. And if we're going to look at hand reading as a subject that can tell us something about ourselves, then probably the fingerprint patterns are the best place to start. Why? Because, and everybody knows this, everybody's fingerprint patterns are unique. Nobody has the same fingerprint patterns as you. Your fingerprint patterns are so unique, even identical twins don't have identical fingerprint patterns. So there's a kind of recognition of the genetic significance of fingerprint patterns, and yet the individuation of those patterns for every individual, including otherwise genetically identical people, identical twins. What we've got in the hand is a kind of, with the fingerprints, is a sort of biometric marker of what is unique about you. And secondly, the other thing about fingerprint patterns is that they don't change over time. Most people kind of don't get that one, and yet when you think about it, it's obviously true, because if the fingerprints changed over time, they really wouldn't be much use for identification purposes and used by crime forces. Mm-hmm. So they don't change over time, so they show something of our identity, and it's those two factors, the uniqueness of the fingerprints and the fact that they show our identity, that really forms the basis of modern chirology.
So I'm thinking, since it is a genetic factor, you're born with a certain fingerprint and a certain shape to your hand, length of your fingers, all these things you're talking about. Is the study of this to learn more about yourself based on this, or is it to learn how to, come up with a way to change things? It may not be the way you want them. Like, why would I want to do this? I mean, other than I'm incredibly curious about it. I think it's super interesting.
I think the starting point is self-knowledge and self-awareness. We human beings, we're born into the world. We're a mixture of the genetic input from our parents. We're a mixture of our nurture from the experiences that we have during childhood. And if you're more metaphysically inclined, then there's a bit of a je ne sais quoi of spirit or karma or whatever you want to say as an admixture that comes in. So with this kind of mixed up agglomeration of different forces within us that shape our personality, that shape our character. We're each of us born with particular gifts and abilities. Some people are really good at running, some people are phenomenal at playing the guitar, some people, can write a book, and some people can sing a song. I mean, we all have different skills. You can say, well, everyone can do everything, but some people are exceptional in particular areas. And a lot of our life is, especially when we're young, is trying to find out, well, what have I got? What can I do? That's what makes me sing? What works for me? Who am I? And what am I going to do with my life? And I think, that's the question that's being asked by many people, and hand reading provides a lot of those answers. So you can see that in a number of different ways. First of all, psychologically, I think one of the most significant aspects of studying hand reading is having a blueprint. You've got a blueprint on your hand that describes something, the forces that make up your psychological dispositions. There's a colleague of mine in Brisbane in Australia who's been working the last 25, 30 years comparing the Myers-Briggs type inventory and hand reading, trying to work out how those two things correlate together. Because there's no question that when you do something like the MBTI, you get an idea of your profile, but hand reading is so much more in depth than even something as good as the MBTI. So there's a psychological component in that. But also, equally, if you can see particular gifts and skills that someone's born with, you can give them advice on what kind of career they should do, what kind of courses they should study, where they should put their energy in their life. So you can really help people make decisions about what they can do with their lives. And probably the most common reaction I have when I read the hands of people in their 50s, nearly every time they say, I wish someone had told me that 30 years ago. So it's like if you're 20, 25 and you're kind of trying to work out what to do with your life, you will eventually find out by trial and error, by kind of marrying the wrong man or going and doing the wrong job, and then eventually realizing that you're not a doctor at all, you're actually an artist, but your parents didn't encourage you in those kind of skills. And in your 50s, you suddenly work out, actually, this is what I should have been doing all my life. And you've spent 30 years doing something completely different. And that's the thing. If you can work that out, if you can see those things and have, why wouldn't you want to know that when you were young? Because you can get on and do those things from a younger age. So those are the two most common things. I think when people come for hand reading, they say, I want to know more about who I am, and I want to know what kind of things I can do in my life so I can shape my own life. It's like learning what you've got and how to make the most of that in your life, and that enables people then to shape their own life their own way.
Yeah, that's a really interesting idea, because there's a lot of folks that pursue a path that they're guided toward, steered toward, told that this is what you should do to be secure and safe, and this is what our family does. This is who we are as a family and as a historically. And a lot of people have a disturbance inside of them because their instincts are telling them something completely different, and they have to shove it down. And so there's a lot of agitation, I think, with people that for whatever reason don't or can't follow those instincts. Because I think sort of on a very inside, personal metaphysical level, people kind of know what they are if they're able to clear away the societal and parental constrictions.
Absolutely.
This would be an extra level of, oh no, you are an artist. You're
exactly
not, you're not an engineer. I know your dad did that, but
That's exactly it, Bob. You've got it in a nutshell. And I think, people's self-identity is so created and fabricated by the demands from around them, from the input that they get from their schooling, from education, from politics, from propaganda, from an economic necessity, in fact. So people will make career choices about what they need to earn money. And so there are materialistic concerns that are usually emphasized, and what people and why they make the choices they do that don't necessarily satisfy their spirit. And that's why I think we have a lot of mental health issues. I think it's why we have a lot of alienation. That's why we have a lot of anger in the world, because people aren't feeling fulfilled, because they're kind of not living in accordance with themselves. They've been given this set of instructions or this compulsion to go and do certain things, or been encouraged to behave in a certain kind of way that doesn't sit well with them. And that sooner or later is going to make people ill, either mentally or physically. Yeah. And I think there's a huge consequence of that. So hand reading is like literally dissolving away the ideas about yourself that have been given to you that have no relationship to you whatsoever. It's like a sort of deconstruction of a kind of false self, if you like. And so you can actually get an idea of what it is to be you. And that was actually my experience. I mean, I had my hands read when I was 20 years of age when I first came across hand reading. And, which is a great age to be discovering those things about yourself. But I basically found that my hand described impulses and orientations within me that were kind of instinctively there, and I was able to kind of direct my life on that. But there's a deconstruction process that has to go with that. And the problem is a really pragmatic one. I mean, it's if you're a writer or you're an artist, can you make a living at that? Well, maybe not. And maybe you have to go and do something else. I mean, many musicians work in hospitality, they're waiters or work in bars or whatever else because they need a part-time job to support their gigging career. and they may or may not make it as musicians. But so that's a kind of a fundamental choice that we as individuals have to make, I think. Do we want to make money and be financially stable, or do we want to be fulfilled? What I know is that when we die, we don't take any of that money with us, you know. So it's kind of like there's a kind of like and nobody ever on their deathbed said, "I wish I'd spent more time at the office." There's no what no the regrets of the
Yeah.
dying do not include, "I
Oh.
wish I'd worked more. I wish I'd given more money to the American government. I wish I'd spent 80 hours a week at work instead of 40." Nobody ever says that, you know. It's
Well,
like,
from what
you
I've
know,
read, the biggest regret of dying people is I wish I would have tried X, Y, or Z,
yes.
and I never did. Or and it's a thing, and maybe there's a balance too. I mean, there is certainly, if you want to be in any of the arts, it is a precarious way to make a living, and most people they aren't able to make a living that way. It's just the reality of the arts. There's a certain percentage of people that
And that's probably a skewing of our culture and our society that
yes,
doesn't
yes,
prioritize that, you
but
know.
maybe there's a
It's
balance. Maybe
Yeah,
it's like
but that's an economic and a political decision which is out of our hands. So
yeah,
then it becomes a decision about whether you're going to prioritize the expression of the creative expression of life itself, of you as an individual and what that means to you, or are you going to enslave yourself into the
yeah,
commerce machine, you know? And that's a kind of, essentially that's a political act. And so I do see hand reading as quite a kind of a radical political act, because it's basically saying, be you. And actually, it's okay to be you. There's a guy I know at university in the UK who's doing a PhD research on the effects of hand reading, and he's consulted with a lot of people who've had hand readings, and he's basically trying to say to them, what was the impact on you? What did it mean to you? What was it about? How did it affect you? And what he's finding is that the most important thing that people say after having a hand reader, they say, "I feel I've been given permission to be myself. I have been seen like no one's ever seen me before. I feel understood. I feel like you know what it's like to be me, and that's okay." And it really is an incredibly profound experience having your hands read, because what we're looking at the hand really are we're looking at the features of the hand that describe motivational patterns of human experience. So we're not describing events, we're not describing out there things, we're not describing what happens to somebody, but we are describing processes within their consciousness that create the story of that person's life. And as hand readers, we're really good storytellers. We can look at the different ingredients and we can weave them together to create a description of the story of that person. And in effect, what we're doing is we're recreating out loud with a handprint in front of us the narrative of that story of that person has about themselves and their lives, because we can see the effects of certain experiences, we can see the effects of certain genetic patterns, we can see the impact of childhood upbringing, we can see the development of skills and abilities, or the presence of particular skills and abilities. And each of us has all of those ingredients. And what we do with them is what weaves the narrative of any individual's life. And whatever difficulties we have when we're younger usually turn out to be a skill later on. You know, we're old enough to know that some of the things that happened to us may have been really bad at the time, but it made us a stronger person, gave us insights, gave us understanding, and later in life we can employ that in some more useful kind of way. So how we do that as individuals is really the psychology of what it is to be an individual. And a hand reader is really looking at how to describe that and using the hand as a springboard to describe that process. And when you do that, people go, "Oh my gosh, you really know me. You really understand how I work and what makes me tick." And that affirmation is an extraordinary thing for people. I mean, people are desperate for contact and connection and touch and recognition and being seen, not necessarily for fame and all those
right.
superficial things that we're getting these days from Hollywood onto Instagram. We're not talking about that stuff, but that's a symptom of it, I think, is that I want to be seen, I want to be connected to. But it's a product of a kind of wanting to be connected to their own inner core. So how great is it if you've got something that gives you a map that gives you access to find out what that is? And that's what the hand is about. And the Palmistry of Fingerprints really describes that from the point of view of the fingerprints. It starts with the fingerprints because the fingerprints show what's unique about you. They are markers of your incarnation in this world that is distinctively you. What is it to be you is the
Yeah.
question to be answered.
I was I don't know why I thought this while you were talking. I was listening too, though, of course. But I was thinking about, of all things, I was thinking about Jimi Hendrix and how he had these really long fingers and he could have this huge reach on the neck of the guitar, and he had this ability, yeah, and he was just incredible. And I was thinking about, because you had mentioned the length of the fingers, and he had
Yeah.
this, like, he was given this gift.
Yeah.
Um, now, would you or anyone have been able to tell that, or is the length of the fingers just part of the whole picture? And maybe there's other people that have long fingers that would not be good at that, and there's some other
Well,
factors that come in. I mean, how many sort of pieces of information do you have to mix together to kind of get a somewhat of an accurate reading of a person?
you're asking a really good question. And what's interesting about you talking about Jimi Hendrix is Jimi Hendrix, of course, is an exceptional musician and exceptional guitarist, and there's no dispute about that. He's Rolling Stones' number one guitarist of the 20th century. I mean, and rightfully so. I mean, the cultural impact of Jimi Hendrix has been, is inestimable, really. But I actually have Jimi Hendrix's fingerprint patterns. So there's not just his hands, but also his fingerprints. And I talk about him in my book, in the
Oh,
Palmistry of Fingerprint Patterns. I've got a whole chapter on, just on Jimi Hendrix.
really? Look
And
at
the
me
reason,
figuring
yeah,
shit
yeah,
out
yeah.
that I don't not supposed to know, but I know it.
Yeah, 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 exactly. You figured it out already, man. I mean, so here's the hypothesis, right? So if we accept, and I don't think anyone's going to argue, Jimi Hendrix was an exceptional musician and an exceptional creative influence. Okay, no question. No one's arguing with that. So let's look at his hand. Let's see what's exceptional in his hand. And what he has an exceptional fingerprint pattern on the index finger of his left hand. Now, as we all know, Jimi Hendrix was left-handed. So
Mhm.
when we're looking at the hands, the hand dominance matters. So if you're left-handed, your left hand is more an expression of your individuality, and the right hand is more an expression of the things you've inherited from your family or background material that's affecting your life. And reverse if you're right-handed. So your dominant hand shows the dominant patterns, the dominant characteristics, the dominant features of the hand are going to describe those characteristics. But he has literally an extraordinarily rare fingerprint pattern on the index finger of his left hand. And in my book, The Palmistry of Fingerprints, I start talking about him because I got in contact with a guy called Andres Washington who lives in New York, who quite independently of me has been studying fingerprints for about 45 years. He's a former corrections officer, and he's done all his fingerprint studies, and he basically has access to a database of 18 million fingerprint patterns, male fingerprint patterns, and 4 million female fingerprint patterns. Fingerprint patterns are distributed differently amongst men and women, by the way, so that's an important distinction to make. And he, on his website, he's talked about Jimi Hendrix in there because he talks about how Jimi Hendrix is so exceptional. And he's a mathematician, so he does his statistical analysis. I can't tell you off the top of my head how rare exactly Jimi Hendrix fingerprint is, but he's got it on his website as an example of an extraordinarily rare, statistically speaking, extraordinarily rare fingerprint pattern that's found on that. And his whole website's about that. His thesis is basically the more interesting, unusual, different, original person they are, the more likely that they will have a fingerprint pattern that is different, distinctive, and unusual in some kind of way. And he's just done a statistical analysis of that. So he's done all the work for me. And so I kind of got in touch with him. And I said, that's how I got Jimi Hendrix's fingerprints. I mean, he got them from the FBI. Hendrix was in the army, so his
Yeah.
his army records were available. Um, and so Andres supplied me with the fingerprints. So I wrote about Jimi Hendrix's hand in my book and the Palmistry fingerprint patterns precisely because it illustrates exactly this point that unusual and exceptional people have unusual and exceptional fingerprint patterns. And if that's the case, then if we can analyze the fingerprint patterns, that will tell us something that's unusual and exceptional about each of us as individuals. And that's not just my opinion. That's kind of like this guy, Andrew Washington, has been doing this for 45 years, and he produces these extraordinarily complicated Excel spreadsheet charts, which I have to ask him for help to understand because that's not my thing at all. But he's come up with the same conclusion that fingerprint patterns show what's unique and different about us.
They usually do thumbprints, but you're saying index finger is even more
Well,
valuable.
yeah, Yeah, the index finger is most important. I mean, I'll just give you a brief outline about that if you like, because it's probably helpful to understand something about that. I mean, there are 8 billion different fingerprint patterns because every fingerprint pattern is unique, but they actually fall into types. There are three main fingerprint patterns, which are called loops, arches, and whorls. And then there are four less common fingerprint patterns, um, radial loops, double loops, compound whorls, and tension arches. And then there's about three or four other sort of very, very minor anomalous characteristics. So those first three, the loops, the arches, and the whorl, that's about 85% of all fingerprint patterns in the world are fall into one of those three categories. And then the next 14% of the minor ones, and then there's 1% of the anomalies. So it's interesting that 99% of all fingerprint patterns can be classified into one of seven types. So there are only seven types of fingerprint patterns. And in my book, The Palmistry of Fingerprint Patterns, I show people how to identify those seven so you can clearly work out which ones they are and then identify them on your fingers. So that's the first thing, is like there are only seven types of fingerprint patterns. But they don't all happen to occur on the fingers in the same degree. So some fingers have some patterns incredibly well presented, and other fingers they have much fewer of them. The easiest example is the loop, the loop fingerprint pattern, which kind of looks like a wave. It goes up and around like that as a wave shape, and that occurs on about 85% of the little finger. So just about every fingerprint pattern on your little finger is going to be a loop. Most of the time, 85% of the time, that will be 8 out of 10, it'll be a loop. But on the index finger, the ulnar loop only occurs on about 30%, which means the other 70% is taken up by the other six fingerprint patterns. So the fingerprint pattern that's on the index finger is the most varied.
Oh,
And
okay.
that's just a statistical fact,
Hmm.
simply because the ulnar loop, the most common fingerprint pattern, is much rarer on that fingerprint. So the other ones can occur more frequently. And what's interesting about that is in palmistry, and I'm talking even the Victorian palmistry as well, the index finger was always thought of as the sense of your identity to do with your ego, your idea of yourself, your self-belief. This is the I finger. I mean, this is the finger we wag. I am telling you what to do.
Yeah,
this is
sure.
what we do with this finger. This is the finger of our own personal power and authority. And it's this finger, which is to do with our identity, psychologically speaking, is the finger which has the most distinctive fingerprint on it. So there's a nice little confluence of, if you like, palmistry law and medical dermatoglyphic statistical data that kind of coincide and dovetail very cleanly here. So that's why the fingerprint on the index finger is most important. And it's the same if it's the same again if you look at any of these people. I mean, you could if you look at John Lennon, it's the same thing. He has a very distinctive set of fingerprint patterns. Martin Luther King has, Malcolm X has, Eisenhower, Richard Nixon. I mean, all these people, we've got their fingerprint patterns, and what you find, because they're all quite exceptional in all different kinds of ways, but they have exceptional fingerprint patterns. And of all of the ones, it's the one on the index finger that's the most significant, most important, because it's the most distinctive. So if you want to find out what's most different about you, find out what fingerprint you've got on your index finger. That's the one that's going to
All
tell you
right.
about you.
Well, that's the next thing to do after lunch. I was thinking about well, also when you look at sort of on the more negative side of like criminals and psychopaths and that kind of thing, is there like things that are recognized there in fingerprints too? Because I know obviously criminals are fingerprinted to a
Yeah,
huge
but
degree.
funnily enough, the fingerprints don't show criminality. That's an
Okay.
interesting thing. They show identity.
Okay.
So they show who we are. So we can identify people definitively by virtue of the fingerprint patterns.
So
But what we see when you study the psychopathic conditions of people who are criminals, I mean people who are incarcerated, and we actually notice a different kind of patterning going on there, and it's not in the fingerprint patterns at all. I've got a book which has got handprints of Ted Bundy and Charles Manson and people like that in it, and I had access to a high security prison in England in the 1990s, and I got about 25 handprints of serial murderers and rapists and arsonists and drug lords and bank robbers. And what's interesting when you look at all those hands, there's nothing distinctive from the fingerprint patterns at all. They've all got the same distribution of fingerprints as you get anywhere else, really, in any population. So the fingerprints are not the thing that indicative of their psychopathy. What's particularly noteworthy is the length of what in palmistry is called the heart line. I like to call it the upper transverse line, the one that runs underneath the fingers going towards your index finger. So the length of the hypothesis we have is that the length of a line is to do with how much of a quality you have. So the headline or the intellect line is to do with how your cognitive processes and how you apply your intelligence. And the longer the line, generally speaking, the more analytical somebody is, the more studious they are, the more they think about things. With the water line, the heart line, the longer the line, the more emotional a person is, the more sensitive they are, the more caring they are, the more considerate they are of other people. And so you see very long lines in people like therapists and nurses and people who are working in the caring professions, and people who are spiritually orientated. And so what was noticeable about this sample, albeit it's only a small sample, it's about 25 handprints, was how rare it is to see short waterlines in the general population, and about half of these people had very short waterlines in these criminals. So the waterline, instead of coming up between the fingers, would be ending about here underneath the middle finger. So it'd be a lot shorter. And so what you've got there, chirologically speaking, is you've got an indicator of somebody who's kind of emotionally repressed or emotionally contained, or someone who doesn't really care about other people, it doesn't really feel other people, doesn't feel their pain, isn't sensitive to them. So it's a kind of mark of insensitivity. And that's probably the quality that you need most of all to be either a soldier or a mass murderer. A mass murderer, a soldier is a mass murderer with a legitimizing stamp on them. But the ability to do what they do without that caring and consideration for the value of human life or the emotional life of somebody else is indicated by that kind of shortness. So it's actually in the lines, and that's one of the interesting things about the hands is, you said like the morphogamy, the shape of the hand is like our genetic thing. We've got the fingerprint patterns, which are kind of like our motivational dispositions, but then our lines are like our experiences and how we utilize the qualities that we have. And so we've got this sort of multi-layered perspective within the hands, and it's in that last layer that we see criminal activity. And we can see how scheming someone is, or how deceptive someone is, how they plan, how they organize, and whether they care. And one of the things that's obvious in those hands is this lack of caring.
There's also a physical relationship between the size of the palm. Let's say you have a very large palm and shorter fingers. So there's a relationship between that size and the length of the fingers. Is that a factor too? Like the relationships between things? Because that's real interesting to me because, when I look at my hands, I'm sort of fascinated. Even as a little kid, I used to look at my hands, and just kind of be, and, when I watch my kids when they were growing up, they would be just playing with their fingers. If you watch little children, they look at their fingers and they move them, and they're very intrigued. They cross their fingers and they try different, little things like this. And, they weave them in and out of each other. I mean, it's a real thing that little kids do. And I remember doing that as a kid. Who knows, why you do that. It's just because they're there and they're so malleable compared to the rest of your body. They really are.
Well, I think there's a couple of things that which are interesting. I mean, first of all, I think with children doing that, they're learning the mobility of the fingers, they're learning the capability of the fingers. And one of the things that's really important to understand about the physiology of the body is there are more nerve connections between the hand and the brain than between the brain and any other part of the body. So the hands are literally an expression of our nervous system. And that, when you think about it, that makes complete sense. There's two major parts of the nervous system. There's the motoric nervous system. So there's the nerves that fire the muscles that make our fingers move, that allow us to play the piano or play the guitar or wiggle your fingers around like the children are doing. So there's the kind of motoric side of it. And that's a kind of a metaphor for the expression of who we are. When we have an idea in our head, we decide we're going to build a a playhouse. We're going to build a tree house. We got the idea in our head, and we get our hands, we get the tools, and we build it with our hands. So the hands are literally expressing into the world the ideas that we have in our head. All of us basically are doing that, whether we're writing or playing the guitar or building a motorway or high rise. Basically we're manifesting in the world an idea in our head. We're making it real through our hands. It's our hands that do the doing. And of course, it's human hands that are different from all other animals, the hands of all other animals. Most animals don't have hands at all. And those that do, i.e. the anthropoid apes, they have very, very, very limited ability to use their hands because their thumbs are very small.
Mm-hmm.
There's a very famous scientist, researcher in the middle of the 20th century called Charlotte Wolfe, she was a doctor and she was a psychiatrist, and she researched mental health issues and schizophrenia and other kind of conditions like that. But she also did this amazing studies on the hands of primates and apes. She had access to all the apes at London Zoo in the 1930s and produced a number of papers looking at their hands. And she basically said it is the mobility of the thumb that basically gives us the ability to do what we do. Without the thumb, we don't have the opposable grasp.
Mm-hmm.
So it's the opposable grasp that allows us to fashion things into tools, that allows us to make the tools that we use to manipulate the world around us. And it is the fact that we can do that, and no other animal can, that we've been able to manipulate the natural world to a far greater extent than any other species that we know about. And that's essentially to do with the thumb. And so the thumb is like a really pivotal thing. So the relationship between the index finger and the thumb is kind of crucial from a motoric nerve ending point of view. So that's about how we manifest in the world. And without the thumbs, we wouldn't be able to have that opposable grasp, and we wouldn't be able to use our hands the way that we do.
Yeah, it's a big
But then
difference.
the second side, a huge difference. But the second side of that is that the hand is also an incredibly important tool from a point of view of sensory information. So, we touch with our hands, we feel with our hands. If it's dark, we use our hands to sense where we're going. Some people can feel the energy coming out of hands, and they can feel the energy around people. They have incredibly sensitive hands. And if you look at your hand, if you hold your hand up like that, you'll notice there's a little bump on the end of the finger like that, little droplet, and there's a concentration of nerve endings right there, right on the fingertip like that. And that's the most sensitive part. If you get your finger and you do that on your skin, you'll find that's the most sensitive part of your finger, is the bit of this little droplet right there. And do you know what's exactly underneath that droplet? The apex of the fingerprint.
Oh.
So the most sensitive part of the finger is exactly where the center of the word is, or the height of the loop is exactly that. The fingerprints are exactly on this most sensitive part. So there's this intimate connection between the fingerprints and the neurology of the human body, and in terms of both the nerves going out, but also the sensory information coming in. And so playing with the hands is really about children exploring this relationship that they can have with the world. Charlotte Wolfe argues again. She basically says, in the developing infant, the opposable thumb is actually one of the ways in which we learn about space. If you think about a baby lying in a cot, and then you pass them something, they just try and grab something, and they go, and then they realize they can hold it, and it's like they can see dimensionality. They can feel dimensionality. So the fact that we can do that is a kind of reflection of the fact that there's 3D-ness comes from this opposable grasp. That idea of 3D-ness gives us an idea of space. An infant doesn't know about space and doesn't know about time. That's a kind of faculty that has to be developed through cognitive awareness and learning and interaction with the world. But the relationship between the finger and the thumb, it seems to be one of the most important factors in that. So the hand is an incredibly powerful tool, both expressively and receptively. And it's all to do with the nervous system. And so there's this intimate connection between the fingerprints and the nervous system, but there's also a really important connection between the lines and the nervous system too. So we know that the interface between these two is paramount because of the number of nerve endings. There are more nerve endings between the brain and the hand than between the hand, the brain, and any other part of the body.
So if I were to hold up my hand, just by the shape of it, obviously you can't see my fingerprints, but if I were to hold up my hand, could you tell me things just by looking at the shape of my hand?
Yes.
All right, I'm going to do it if you're willing to do it.
I didn't say I would do it. I said I
Okay,
can
well, if
do
you
it. It
don't
can
want,
be done.
you can
I
bill
mean,
me.
I mean, yeah. I mean, that's the. I mean, that's the thing. I mean, I do. I collect a lot of hands of famous people like
Hmm.
Obama or Trump or Johnny Depp or Jamie
Yeah,
Foxx or whatever. People who are on the media, and they're always holding their hand up like that. They're always doing that,
yeah.
and you can do screen grabs and you can actually work out quite a lot about them from the shape and structure of the hand. Um, and because of this, really, and you pointed out the important thing you noticed about the hand, and it's important to say this with the hand shape, is the shape and size of your hand will be proportional to the shape and size of your body. So if you take a handprint of somebody, it's a tall, thin, long, thin hand. You've got a tall, thin person. If you get say someone hand and it's a short, squat little hand, it's a short, squat little person. So you can actually describe the shape of the person from the hand shape. Just from let's say you've just got an impression or a print of the hand, you can describe. You can probably work out that you can work out how tall they are from because the length of your palm is proportional to your height. So there's an average. Glove manufacturers know this. They know
Oh,
exactly,
yeah, that would make sense.
how to make hand the sizes for gloves to make, and that's why they can call them small, medium, and large because someone's done the mathematics on that and worked it all out. Um, but yeah, but basically, your hands tend to be proportional to the human head and the human body. So you would expect that. I mean, if you're a slight, small Indian woman, you're going to have a very different hand shape type than a rugby playing Tongan, who's 6'4" and very wide. So you've got I mean, that's an obvious thing, but equally obviously within that gives us certain skills and attributes. The Tongans going to be much better at playing rugby, for example, because of their constitution and their strength. So the hand shape tends to show our physical body and our constitution. The relationship between the fingers and the palm describes something of the relationship the person has between their mind and their body. And
Mm.
the more dominant the palm is, the more physically and experientially orientated the person. The longer the fingers become, the more cerebral, intellectual, or internally orientated the person becomes. So the majority of people have, if you can probably see my hand, you can see my hand's a rectangular palm, and the fingers are short in relationship to the palm.
Hmm.
That's the by far and away the most common hand shape. Your palm looks a bit squarer than mine,
Yeah,
and you've got what's called a simian line in your hand as well. So I'll tell you about that in a minute. Your palm and you've got a very bent little finger. Did you notice how bent your little finger is?
I thought that was arthritis.
Yeah, but you're also a very diplomatic speaker, and you're kind of, you have a very
Yeah.
polite manner in the way that you communicate, which is what's shown by a bent air finger. It's kind of like a diplomatic person who speaks diplomatically and carefully and thoughtfully. But
I
yeah,
know simian means ape.
yeah, it does. Yeah, I'll come to that in a moment because
Okay.
that's an interesting thing. But the hand shape, your hand shape is a bit squarer than mine, and your fingers look long, which is more of a communicator's hand. So if you're
Hmm.
looking at something like the hand shape, you're going to say, are you a doer or you're a talker? Are you a feeler or you're a sort of hands-on, earth mover? The element we use the elements earth, water, fire, and air to describe the hand shape types. But majority of people have fire element hand shapes, so we don't dwell on the hand shape too much. That kind of that whole notion developed out of what I call psychophysiognomy that came out in the mid 19th century when palmistry was revived in the 1840s. There was a French guy, who kind of developed this notion that hand shapes correlated with personality, and out of that came people like Kretschmar, things like phrenology came out of that, and even in fact dermatoglyphics came out of that. There was this whole movement in the 19th century called anthropometry, which was to look at the metrics of the anthropos, the metrics of people, to try and work out their psychology. And one of the people who worked with that was a guy called John Langdon Down. And so in the 19th century, when they didn't have a very sophisticated way of dealing with mental health issues in the 19th century, they had asylums, and the most famous one, of course, is Bedlam, which was actually a mental health institution. I had dared to call it hospital, it was more like a workhouse in London, and it was called Bedlam.
No.
And they basically put all these people in there, whether they had mental health issues or schizophrenia, and also people with Down syndrome, so people who are cognitively challenged. And so this is how they discovered Down syndrome. So John Langdon Down, he was doing his philanthropic work for the poor, and he went into these places and he noticed that there was all these people in these institutions who all looked very much the same. And so he started compiling a list of those characteristics. And this was kind of come out of this whole anthropometric way of trying to work out what somebody's psychology was like from their physical body. And so he recognized that these people with what became known as Down syndrome, named after him, had these particular characteristic physical features and had this characteristic sort of mental orientation and attitude. And so they were recognized together and say, well, this is a syndrome and it's called Down syndrome. And this is 50 years before they recognized that Down syndrome was a chromosomal disorder. They didn't know that in those days. They hadn't done that. Wasn't done until Crick just broke the genetic code in 1946. So this is much earlier. But they recognized, and they were looking for ways to identify psychology by looking at the physical body. And you have to remember that Freud hadn't invented the unconscious yet. Freud's interpretation of dreams didn't get published until 1899. So nobody knew what the unconscious was in those days. So they had no sophisticated way to understand the inner workings of the soul or inner workings of the mind. Psychotherapy, psychoanalysis hadn't been invented. So they were trying to do it through the physical form of the body. And the most successful diagnostic from that was with Down syndrome. And we know that today. And when the fingerprints guys started looking at fingerprint patterns, they started looking for genetic causes of diseases. And one of the conditions that they particularly looked at was Down syndrome. So Down syndrome has become the most studied hand diagnostic in the history of hand reading, in any century, in any culture, at any time. Over 100 years have been looking at the shape and the form of the hand of people with Down syndrome, because they have distinctive features in their hands. And the most common thing that they have in their hand is what's called the simian line. So the simian line is pathognomic for a kind of genetic maladaptation. It occurs in about 1 to 2% of people in the general population sample. It occurs in 55% of people with Down syndrome. Not only in Down syndrome is a chromosomal disorder called trisomy 21. There's also trisomy 13 and trisomy 9 and some other even more rare chromosomal disorders where people with those conditions don't live. They either stillborn or they're born before, they die before they're born. But of those where they live, they can look at their hands and they can see that they've got the simian line. So simian line is an incredibly pathognomic indicator of chromosomal abnormality. And because they're so rare in the general population and so extraordinarily common in people who have these trisomy disorders. It's not just that, by the way. That doesn't mean that you've got Down syndrome, nor is there a chance of you producing anybody with Down syndrome, just to be rest assured. But they couldn't ignore the presence of this pattern. Maybe your left hand looks different. Maybe if you look at your left hand, you can see there are 2 transverse lines across the hand.
Let me see.
Usually speaking,
I don't know if you can see. This is my left.
Yeah, I can see that. In your left hand, you can see there are 2. Like your hand is really square, fantastic. But the 2 lines, you can see the 2 lines going across the hand. So normally in the hand there are 2 transverse lines: the upper transverse line and the lower transverse line. So when you look at your own hands, and people who are listening can do this themselves, you'll notice that there's one line that goes around the thumb. That's called the lifeline or the thenar line. And then there's 2 lines that traverse the hand, the upper and the lower transverse line. And the simian line is where, instead of there being 2 lines, those 2 lines are joined together in one line. So if you look at your right hand, you'll see that those 2 lines are joined together as one line. There's a few little remnants, but can you see how they're crossing the hand like that?
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
So that's unusual. That's about 1% of people. There's some exceptional people who've got that. Robert De Niro, Hillary Clinton, Tony Blair, Louis Theroux, Joaquin Phoenix. There's quite a few people who've got them. Quite a few famous people who've got simian lines. Tony Robbins is another one. But that pattern, when you find it in the hands of people with genetic disorders, it's one of the indicators of that. There was a guy called Lionel Penrose who kind of ran with this stuff. He developed a center outside London called the Kennedy Galton Center, which was basically in the 60s and 70s was run as a genetic screening laboratory. And he would do giant genetic diagnostics for people. This is before we could do karyotyping, before we could do the kind of sophisticated amniotic tests that we can do these days. And basically, he had couples coming to see him in his clinic, and he was able to diagnose from their hands whether or not they were likely to produce a Down syndrome child.
That's extraordinary.
It is extraordinary. So, and he compiled a list of about 7 or 8 features in the hands, which, if you combine them together, the statistical odds are extraordinarily rare to find all those combinations together and not produce a Down syndrome child. I mean, what they include a short little finger, a very bent little finger, which you also have, a simian line, and various dermatoglyphic markers on the fingerprints and in the palm as well. So it's about 4 or 5 different things. Again, in my book, The Palmistry of Fingerprints, I outline all of this in the book because this is incredibly important medical diagnostic stuff. But what they've shown is that the physiological patterns of something extreme as a chromosomal disorder manifest in the hand. And what's interesting about Down syndrome is not, of course, it's, we all know, we've all met Down syndrome people. We know what they're like. We know that they cognitively challenge people, but we also know they're incredibly friendly, emotionally open. They laugh a lot, they play, and they sing and they dance. And so we can we can describe the personality of people with Down syndrome. And we know what their hands look like. I did this as a test with my students last year. I made a list of what would you say about somebody who had all these features in their hand, and I got them to write up a report about what that person would be like. And of course, they all described Down syndrome. They didn't know they were talking about a Down syndrome person, but they actually described the temperament of somebody with Down syndrome. And what you get with these 2 lines, so we talked about the 2 lines, the headline, the lower transverse line to do with intellect, and we talked about the heart line, the upper transverse line to do with sensitivity and emotionality. So normally those 2 functions are separated, but when a simian line is, what you've got is you've got a conflation of emotion and intellect. And in the case of people with Down syndrome, what we know is that their intellect is impaired, but their emotionality is heightened. So what you've got there, instead of having the 2 functions function distinctly, we have a really good example. I mean, this is literally medical science has proven the significance of these lines, because they've said these lines occur in these people who have particular emotional patterns and cognitive challenges. And the palmists go, but that's amazing, because we've always said this is line to do with your emotions and this line to do with how you think. And so you've actually got a kind of an empirical basis for creating the kind of assertions and hypotheses that palmists do. And that's why my book starts from. That's why the medical stuff on fingerprints is really important, and why I've included it in the Palmistry of Fingerprints, is because that's the basis by which we can build a system of hand reading that's far removed from all this prediction and fortune telling and tall dark strangers and babies and how long you're going to live sort of nonsense that you get from medieval palmistry. We have an approach here that's founded upon the observations of real life people with an empiric basis to it. And we don't have all the answers yet, for sure, but we definitely have enough to say these features of the hand are distinctive of these particular characteristics.
Sounds like that book has quite a bit of information that people, if they get the book, they can really do some of their own work by observing their own hand and figuring out based on, I'm assuming there's lots of drawings in there and or photographs that people can sort of compare and see, oh, I have this, I don't have that. This, does this match up with my traits?
Yes. I mean, it's probably important. I mean, I've been emphasizing the science of all this. It's probably important to break. That's only a very small part of the book. The more important part of the book is, and why it's an accessible book is to say, yes, there are lots of illustrations that show you how to identify the fingerprint patterns. And in fact, I've done a whole video of that on my YouTube channel, the Master Hand Reader on YouTube as well. So if you want to watch that, they can go and watch that too.
Oh, great. That's great. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. But once you've identified the fingerprint patterns, the bulk of the book about is what does it mean? What does it mean to have a whirl fingerprint pattern on your index finger? What does it mean to have an arch fingerprint pattern on your ring finger? What does it mean to have a loop on your thumb? And so, I'm having explored how often these fingerprints occur, and then I go through each of the fingerprint patterns and what they indicate when they're found on each of the digits. So that's what I call the psychology of the fingerprints, and that's a really big part of what it is in the content of the book. And for someone who's not had any knowledge of fingerprints, I mean, someone like yourself, you could read the book, you'll learn how to identify the fingerprints, and then you'll be able to work out which fingerprints you've got on which finger. And then you've got a book that part of the book says, well, that's what it means, and explains it to you as well. So it's actually designed to be really easy to read, so it's accessible. But I want it to be profound. There's lots of really bad palmistry books out there that really are very superstitious and talk about stuff that I think has no verification. So what I've tried to include in the palmistry of fingerprints is that knowledge which has some empiric verification to it. I'm only interested in those kind of things. Has it been verified, or can it be verified? I mean, I've got an academic background. I'm a philosopher, I'm a theologian, I've studied yoga and religion most of my adult life. And I'm not interested in superstition. I'm not interested in supposition. I'm interested in stuff that's reproducible. I actually wrote the Palmistry of Fingerprint Patterns in 1991. That's how long ago I wrote it, when I was studying at Oxford University. And I printed about 100 copies of the book back at that time, and I gave it to all my students, the people I was teaching at that time. And what's interesting is that some of those students have had 30-year careers as professional hand readers, and this has been their go-to reference book.
Yeah.
So,
Wow.
they're all really excited it's actually coming out in a book, because it was printed out on an A4 paper on a dot matrix printer, if you remember those.
I do remember that.
Yeah, and their copies are a bit worn out now, but there's quite a number of people who basically who use it as their kind of manual. When they find an interesting fingerprint, they go, oh, what's that? And they just look it up in the book. So even professional hand readers will use this book. So what I like about it, because I talked to them all, I said, okay, so what needs improving? We had a big long conversation about it, and they basically said, well, it's basically all right. And so when I rewrote it 2 years ago, I probably kept about 85% of it, and then there were a few things in there that, I was young. Wasn't even 30 when I wrote it. So I kind of, a few things that are a bit too speculative in there, and I kind of edited those out a little bit and kind of clarified those and sorted them out a little bit and tidied them up, and basically refused to include anything that I thought was too speculative. And so what I've really tried to do, and this is again to answer that very first question, what's the difference between palmistry and chirology, or what's the difference in modern hand reading? Modern hand reading has nothing to do with the stars or astrology or soul incarnation stuff, or superstitious stuff to do with signs and elephants and conches and marks of death and all those sort of things. Those are all products of particular worldviews. What we're interested in is, how can hand reading be based and grounded in empiric experience, and can it be verifiable? So the thing I say to people is, you don't have to be a psychic to be a hand reader. You just have to study it.
Yeah.
And I've taught people who've had 30-year careers as hand readers, and they've taught other people. So the point is, if you have a body of knowledge that's reproducible, you have a body of knowledge that can be replicated by teaching other people. And I've met some of these students of these other students of mine I had never met before. And they have a facility with this knowledge. They kind of don't know that it was me that kind of made the initial discoveries, because they'd never met me before. But what when you've got a body of knowledge that's vibrant and living like that, it will change and modify and develop, because it has that openness to it. So it's not kind of like a fatalistic thing. It's a body of knowledge that's very open and can be verified. And that's what I invite people to do. I say, look, get a copy of the book, have a look at your own fingerprint patterns, try it out on yourself and your friends, and you'll be amazed how much it works. And if it doesn't work, that's fine. But try it from experience. If you haven't had the experience of it, you're not going to know. And if hand reading is what it promises to be, a kind of description of the fundamental forces of who we are, and if that helps someone develop that self-awareness and self-knowledge, that is an incredibly valuable thing to do. If you can help people kind of see them for who they are, and not what society wants them to be, or what their boss wants them to be, or what their school teacher wants them to be, to be the creative individual that they are, to live a life that is an expression of their unique individuality, then any tool that can help you do that is valuable. But a tool that particularly describes those things in your hands that describe your uniqueness, how powerful is that?
Well, it's huge. I mean, like you said, it gives you permission to pursue things that your instincts are probably already giving you signals about. And if it's not, it might open that up, which is an enhancement, and I love that.
I've not found any system of self-diagnosis to be better than hand reading.
Oh,
I mean,
wow.
I'm an astrologer too, and I think astrology's got its own merits too. And I like things like the Myers-Briggs type inventory, and I think there are some good personality profiling things. But the depth and the degree of it, I don't think there's nothing else you can describe your uniqueness in the way that the fingerprints do. There's nothing else that describes the experiences you have like the lines do. I mean, I'm probably a very good, simple example, and it's quite an important contemporary one, is childhood trauma, like sexual abuse and things like that. I mean, you can see the effects of those kind of things in your people's hands, and those are taboo subjects, and those are difficult subjects to encounter. And the therapeutic application of that is absolutely extraordinary. Like I wish more counselors and psychotherapists had studied handling, but the counselors and therapists that I know who do, they use it as a way of kind of working out what the key issues are with their clients. So they can they can see, okay, it's a problem with the mother, or it's a problem with the father, or there's a problem with this, or there was sexual abuse, or whatever it was. They can see from the hand really quite quickly what the patterns of problems are, and therefore that gives them a kind of door of where they're going to take that therapeutic application of hand reading to do.
Now
Yeah.
I have a little bit of a disconnect on this, so maybe you can clarify it.
Okay.
If we're saying you're born with a certain pattern and size and genetic thing, so how does an event affect this thing that to me is a set thing? So
Okay.
so you're saying that
Because
it
it's
isn't.
not, because they're not all set. It's not everything's all set.
Okay,
That's the problem.
that's
Yeah.
my question.
Yeah.
So how does
Yeah. Yeah.
let's say,
Okay. So
because I was going to actually bring up the idea of ancestral trauma in a family.
yes.
How does that come
No,
through over?
absolutely.
Yeah.
Yeah. No, that's clear. That's really clear. Okay. Just to answer your question, first of all, there are some things in the hands that you're born with them and they don't change.
Okay.
That's your fingerprint patterns. So again, in the Palmistry of Fingerprints, I argue if we're going to study the hand at all, we need to start with the fingerprint patterns
Okay.
because they are dispositional, they're unchanging, they form in the womb at around the 16th to 24th week of gestation, and they don't change throughout your entire life. So they show your uniqueness, and they are identifiers for who and what you are, and they don't change throughout your life. They're the most important thing. But the features of the hand, like the hand shape, changes quite slowly, but it changes as we grow up. So if you look at the hand of a child, this is my daughter, age about a year and a half,
Yeah.
and you can see how she's got a really square little palm and little fingers.
Mm-hmm.
And
Yep.
she's now a grown woman. She's in her 20s now, and she's tall and thin, and she's got long, thin hands. So in other words, all babies, if you look at all people, all babies, no matter how big they turn out, they're all about the same size. They're all about,
Yeah.
because they have to be, because they're gestated in the human womb.
Yeah. You can only
womb.
get so big in there before
Exactly.
there's
So
a
all
problem.
babies are kind of like short little squat little things, and then as they grow, they kind of extend and expand. And so that you can't really look at the hands of a child and say much about them because you don't know how that child is going to grow.
Okay.
So you need to wait till the physical body has finished growing. So at least 17, 18, maybe you could argue 23, 24. But anyway, most of that growing spurt right through to the other side of puberty is clearly incredibly important. And that you can't really analyze the hands of children because you don't know what they're going to be looking like. Now, because the hands change, the fingers kind of grow like that. And some of the times the fingers don't grow as well, or they grow bent, or they grow distorted. If you look at my index finger, you can probably see that my index finger's bent towards the middle finger. Can you see
Yes.
that?
Yes, I
Or,
can.
or your little finger, which is also bent as
Yeah.
well. Assuming that's not caused by an accident,
Mhm.
that is probably caused by a developmental thing. So what we can see is the hand develops from this squat little square thing as the hand unfurls. It's like a plant growing, and if it
Yeah.
grows strong, it will grow big. And if it's the problem with the growth, it will grow distorted, like a tree or a plant will grow distorted. So the hand changes, all right? So the physical structure of the hand changes because the body changes from birth through to adulthood. So some of the effects of childhood experiences are recorded in the morphogamy of the hand. But more importantly is that the lines of the hand change a lot. So the lines of the hands are not constant; they're not fixed at all.
Okay.
And I mean that's a slightly more complicated. I'm being a bit simple really to say that, but the the three main lines they change least because they have a more stronger genetic component. Hence, the simian line is associated with Down syndrome. But all the little lines of the hand change quite rapidly, and these main lines can change quite a lot. In fact, in the Palmistry of Fingerprints at the beginning of the book, I've got two examples of handprints and I put in there of people who've changed. One's over a 13-year period and one's over a 41-year period. So, and when you take the handprints at different times, you can see how dramatically the lines of the hand change over time. And it becomes clear that the lines are not fixed at all. And in the book, the Palmistry of Fingerprints, I start the book with that to say, look, everybody thinks palmistry is about the lines, but actually they're not that important because they change. And that's why we should study the fingerprints because they don't change. But for the purposes of this conversation now, the fact that the lines change means the lines change in accordance with our experiences. I mean, the obvious ones are hormonal changes. If you track a woman during pregnancy, before, during, and after pregnancy, you'll see changes. Illness and ill health, the lines change a lot during illness and ill health and then in recovery. Stress levels, you get more lines on the hand when you're stressed. And I mean, look, and all of these things are obvious because, as we've already established, there's more neural connections between the brain and the hand than between the hand and any other part of the body. So that the connection between these two is that the level of psychological activity going on there is what produces the increased number of lines. So lineation is a direct correlation with neurological activity, we think. So yes, so that's how those experiences get recorded in the hand, and that's how those kind of traumatic experiences can be seen in the hand. And if we see those patternings in the hand, then we've got an indication of something of the responses that the person's had to certain life events, which we're able to map and point back to. We don't know what the trauma is. I mean, that would be ridiculous to say that we know that, but we can see what life strategies a person has adopted to survive. As Gabor Mate says, trauma isn't what happened to you. Trauma is how you respond to what's happened to you. And so what we're seeing is the responses that people have made to particular situations and circumstances. And so but that allows us as perceptive hand readers to make an inference as to about what goes on. And if you're in a psychotherapeutic consultation with somebody, that gives you enough information to ask the question and invite the discussion. I mean, the issue about child abuse and sexual abuse and those sort of things is, it's a really obviously a very sensitive one, but a lot of times people have been in denial about it, or they've been in denial to themselves, or the people didn't believe them. I mean, look at all the women who suffered at the hand of Harvey Weinstein or Jeffrey Epstein. It took 70 women to bring down Harvey Weinstein.
Right.
Because nobody believes them. I mean, and that's part of the patterning that goes on there. But again, when you have a sort of a system that can say, no, actually, there is evidence that something happened there. You've got a way to allow people to get in touch with what they know instinctively is their own experience, but they have been denied to it. Like you were saying before about whether that's to do with how people live in the world psychologically or how they live in the world in terms of the work that they do. They're not in touch with themselves, then their life is inauthentic. And being able to get in touch with that yourself, no matter how painful that is or how original that is, that doesn't matter. That authenticity is the key thing. And I think probably that's the most important thing about hand reading is it allows us to get in touch with what is authentic. And if we can get in touch with that, then we can live authentically. And if we can live authentically, then we live with meaning. And I think that's why we have a crisis of meaning in modern times, is because people aren't able to live authentically. And they don't know how to live authentically because they don't know what it is to be them. But to be authentic is literally to be the author of your own experience. So if you're the author of your own experience, who's writing the story?
Yeah, you are.
And what are the forces that are writing your story?
We can lie to ourselves and we can lie to other people. That's not hard to do. There's denial and delusion and just outright
Well,
I don't want to tell the truth, but the body will show things despite the fact that you may be saying one thing, but your body will be indicating through a variety of things, stress levels, physical ailments, twitches, and now the lines in the palm,
mm,
uh, other vibrational forces that they've sort of figured out with tuning forks and things like that. It's a
yeah.
really fascinating thing that the body is smarter than the mind in that way.
I say the body knows the score, as they say.
Yeah.
It really, it is a really fascinating interface. I mean, when I was studying handwriting in the 90s, and I kind of first started uncovering things like abuse issues in the hand, we didn't have the language back then to describe that. I mean, with people like Gabor Mate and Bessel van der Kolk, we've got these really good books that really help us to articulate that, and it's much more acceptable topic of conversation. Have we got a language for talking about it? But it is insofar as the body holds trauma, which is kind of quite widely accepted in those therapeutic circles, at least. It's not too big a stretch to say, well, actually, funny enough, the hand records the trauma as well. And so this is what I'm saying. The hand shows your genetic
Mhm.
dispositions, your nature, but it shows your nurture, the kind of things that happen to you. It kind of shows the things that have kind of, your educational experiences, your upbringing, your childhood, those kind of things are recorded in your hand. So because those things have a lasting impact on who you are. They are part of that wiring process that makes up psychology of you as an individual.
I had no idea what I was going to learn today, so I'm really excited about everything you've told me. This is all brand new to me. I only knew about this from, palm reading the future, at some little, place.
Well, that's the thing. The future is actually the thing you can't see. You can see the past. You can see
Yeah,
the impacts of past events, but you can't see the future. And do you know why you can't see the future?
and
What?
it hasn't happened yet. So,
It hasn't happened exactly. So the point, but the thing is, if the lines change over time, you don't know what they're going to look like in 10 years' time or
I
20
also
years' time.
I don't even
So
want to know. I've never
no,
really.
but I agree with you. But if you did make that assertion,
Mhm.
you'd have to basically assume that the lines didn't change, because what you're looking at the lines in the hand, which is what palmers do predictions from, they're making a prediction on how those are at this moment, because that's what they're looking at. They can't say, oh, well, in 20 years' time, that line will still be there, because it won't be there, because the lines of the hands change. And that's, again, in the Palmistry of Fingerprints, why I put those handprints there. To say, once you know that the lines of the hands change, then you know it's not possible to do prediction from the lines.
Before we go, let's talk about the book, the
Okay.
YouTube channel, and anything else that you may have going on, so people can further their knowledge.
Cool. Thank you. Yeah. Well, the book's called The Palmistry of Fingerprints. So it's a readable, accessible, comprehensive book about fingerprint patterns, describing what they are, a little bit about the history, a little bit of recognition of the different fingerprint patterns that occur in different people around the world. I mentioned fingerprint patterns are different between the hands of men and the hands of women.
Mhm.
Once you've classified your own fingerprint patterns, then the bulk of the book is interpretation of those fingerprint patterns. So what
Okay.
it means to have the different fingerprints on each finger. But
Mhm.
then I also look at the palmar patterns as well. There are palmar dermatoglyphic or patterns in the scrivenages in the palm too, and I talk about those. I give some examples in the book about some interpretations. We've got Jimi Hendrix. We talked about him. I've got analysis of his fingerprints, John Lennon's fingerprints, Malcolm X. I've got his fingerprints in there as well. And then I look at the medical and the genetic significance of fingerprints too. So it's a comprehensive volume, and that's available from Amazon.com. And you can order that online or Amazon.co.uk. I think it's available at Barnes and Nobles as well. But obviously, the easiest way to do it is to do it online on Amazon. So get the book. That's going to blow your mind. It's a fascinating read. If you want to know more about handwriting, probably the easiest place to go is to go to my YouTube channel, which is at Master Handreader. So youtube.com// at Master Handreader. There's about 120 videos on there at the
Oh, wow.
moment,
Okay.
and there's lots of introductory videos. I do a lot of little videos about hand readings that I've done when I go to fairs and markets and things I've discovered about hand reading. There's some explainer videos, and there's also one 45-minute video on there, which is all about how to identify the fingerprint patterns as well. So that kind of dovetails very nicely with the book. And if people are seriously interested in learning handreading, if it's something you'd want to study or something you want to find out more about, I have a Patreon site, www.patreon.com/handreading. And people can sign up to there and start to take courses with me. And that's part of the International Handreading Association. And we have a website at handreadinginternational.com.
Thank you for being on the show. What a great! I'm so glad you reached out, and I'm glad we did this. Keep up the good work, my friend. Christopher Jones, everybody.
Look, thank you very much for having me. It's been a pleasure talking to you. I've loved your questions and your thoughtfulness about all this. And yeah, I look forward to meeting you again sometime when we can do this again when the next book comes out.
Much appreciation for you folks listening to The Exploding Human. The website is theexplodinghuman.com. There is a YouTube channel where you can listen. That is The Exploding Human with Bob Nickman. Once again, I want to thank Christopher Jones for being on the show. Check out his new book, The Palmistry of Fingerprints, and his YouTube channel, Master Handreader. Have a great day. Thank you.